Menge, and he would talk about latest advances in decision modeling and related standards. And Falko has a very serious experience in different decision intelligence techniques. And he is the senior principal solution architect at Camunda. But he also very active in all these standardization efforts. And as a result, probably last year when Gary Hallmark decided to resign, Falko became revision task DMN co-chair, and he is the right person to tell us what's happening with this DMN standard and new standards that coming after. Falko, take over.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, with that introduction, I guess I owe you a little bit of an apology as well, because Jacob has been inviting me to DecisionCAMP year over year as a speaker, and it always kind of collided with other obligations. But this year I finally said, let's do it, and let's give people an overview what's happening behind the scenes of the different standardization task forces that are relevant for decision modeling. And I even managed to convince some of my colleagues to also give a talk about Camunda. So I can fully focus now just on OMG work in my presentation. And in the other talk, you will see a little bit more about what we are doing with DMN in particular at Camunda. All right. Yeah, long list of specs that I've been working on. Today, my focus will be mostly on DMN and feel. I have to admit my talk will not be for beginners. I still want to take a minute to maybe recap a little bit on the design goals between DMN and the feel expression language. So generally, obviously, DMN as decision model annotation has been designed to be a bridge between business analysts and developers, something that is understandable enough for non-IT people, but executable enough so that we can really develop executable logic and can automate it. And DMN has actually been the most successful standard in the ecosystem that has evolved around BPMN after BPMN itself, obviously. And I cannot emphasize enough that the feel expression language, the friendly enough expression language, is a super fundamental part to making DMN executable and also interoperable between vendors, because it may look like a bit of a technical expression language like JSON path or JQR, but it's fully standardized and it comes with a function library that we are also maintaining very well. And therefore, it's really a business-friendly alternative to some of these more technical languages that have maybe been traditionally used by business rule systems or the likes. And also, what is very important nowadays is feel is not only part of DMN models, but it can also be used in BPMN models and also in SDMN models. And I will particularly introduce SDMN today as well. So actually, our task force at the OMG is working almost like up to 80% of all the effort is going only into this expression language. And the remaining parts of the language are relatively stable, one can say. And feels really what makes the language technology agnostic. It decouples it from any programming platform and also makes it interchangeable. So as a bit of a preparation here, I was wondering, how well are the different versions adopted from DMN? So obviously DMN versions 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3, they have a pretty great adoption here. So the graphs are based on searches on GitHub and on Google. So it's probably overemphasizing a little bit more what's happening in the open source ecosystem, but it's kind of biased however you ask the question. So therefore, I even decided to integrate them into one single chart so you just get a rough feeling. So it looks like until 1.3, we have relatively good adoption. And then starting with 1.4 and 1.5, we're getting a bit slower. And 1.6, well, that's super hot out of the press. So that's not even completely published yet by OMG. So therefore, that's understandable that vendors haven't jumped on that yet. And obviously, motivation for me is to increase that part by giving you a bit of an intro into the latest versions so that we can maybe see a bit more adoption in the future. So, and I know it was not in my abstract to talk about DMN 1.5, but since last month DMN 1.5 was completely adopted and published by OMG, I thought let's take that in. Also, I noticed it wasn't covered last year on DecisionCAMP, so why not have a quick look into that? Although DMN 1.5 is probably pretty standard release, no really huge additions to it, more like smaller things that have been that are addressing problems reported by users, by implementers, and a big source is also our technology compatibility kit, which is our kind of test suite project that also discovers issues with the language, stuff that is not clear enough in the specification for implementers. So I will start with feel, just again to emphasize how important that expression language is. And the more interesting feature additions are, for example, scientific number notation. If anybody's using DMN in a scientific context, then it might be very helpful to express large or small numbers with the exponent notation. Then we have a new feature that we can iterate over date ranges, which, for example, if you want to iterate over the days of this conference and some decision, makes that very easy to express. Then there's list replacement, so you can replace items in a list very easily without kind of recreating the entire list. So that saves you almost a screen full of field code that you would have to write otherwise. And there are a couple of smaller additions here, like range conversion from string and to kind of allow equality operators in unary test. Then when it comes to DMN, so the kind of overall decision modeling part, except apart from the expression language.
Falko, I'm sorry to interrupt. In this bullet for loop, is this second add is necessary and all these quotations, or this is optional?
No, that's necessary. So this is basically the literal notation for dates. So that add is intentional, it's not a typo, and we're wanting to express it between two dates.
So it just looks a little bit unfriendly. Or okay, anyway, keep going. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Well, DMN 1.5, here we have a rare occasion of retouching the notation. And in this case, we have introduced an alternative notation for input data. And that is what we see on the right-hand side in the screenshot. So we are permitting an alternative notation that looks very similar to the DMN, to the BPMN data object symbol. And pay close attention to that. We will probably see that later in the presentation to see how this all comes together between the languages. Another interesting thing for decision tables, you can define for each column the allowed values. And historically, that was basically just a list of permitted values. But that can become pretty cumbersome. For example, think about age as a column, right? Where you would not want to list numbers from 1 to, I don't know, what, 100, 110, 120. Or, well, depends what animal you're talking about, I guess. So it would be much more meaningful to say you can express age with a unary test saying it needs to be greater than 0. And then you have a number range that works. So yeah, that's a more powerful constraint, which is, again, learning from the practice and making the language more useful. Yeah, I will not to spend too much time on these other things. Obviously, we are improving the examples. And also, I include a lot of links in the slides. Feel free to grab them later from the website. Some of them are for members only. Sorry for that. But if anybody wants to really dig into the particular changes of the language, I included the JIRA links as well. So yeah, here's just another visualization for that harmonization. So now if you see a BPMN model, which pumps data into a decision task, then that can be modeled in the very same way inside the DMN DRD to show that input data is really the very same thing that you have been throwing into the decision task in BPMN. And well, the same is true here for the result. In this case, we're using a notation for the collection that has been added in DMN 1.4 already. Right. Again, this one we'll see again later on when we're talking about more data modeling. Now, let me come to DMN 1.6, the one that was in the abstract. This one has been submitted and approved by OMG's architecture board in June this year. and the final publication will likely be somewhere next year. But until then, vendors are already encouraged to start implementing it and adopting it. And I think the beta version should already be on the website as well. And yeah, let's first look again at feel. And there's already something weird going on in my way to write feel. So let's see what we find there. First of all, more of the smaller features here. So we have a JSON mapping now. Finally, this almost made it into DMN 1.4, or 1.5, but we kind of missed something and had to pull it out at the last moment. Sometimes that happens. We're just humans in the task force as well. We have a couple of new field functions to allow shorter notations for rounding, for example. And one that I want to highlight a little bit is the descendant operator. So this allows you to write expressions to navigate it along a larger tree structure, an object tree, and just note, for example, the beginning of the tree, the entry point, and then search anywhere in the tree for any leaf elements. So this is maybe known to developers that know JSON path, or XPath also has similar notations. However, in DMN, we had to discuss that a little bit longer because we had already the 2 dots reserved for range expressions. So we needed to agree on 3 dots as the compromise. And one could maybe argue that's even more business friendly, because 3 dots is what normal people use to say something is left out in between 2 things. So yeah, maybe that's helpful. And a couple of smaller data type things, which are not too super exciting. Now for the big project in DMN 1.6. I have a couple of example expressions here, and maybe you can tell me in the chat if you can say what would be the result of any of these expressions. And I guess so. I have like 3 little examples here. Maybe I can bring them on. So today is today. We have something like a string and a date that goes together. Here we have a comparison between a string and a number. And we also have a sum of a couple of numbers and null going inside here. And maybe the way I'm asking the question, the result's actually the same. It's null for all of them because of a...
It's just me, but you can't see anything apart from the title on that slide.
Ooh, okay. Then maybe there's a problem with the animation here.
Yeah,
let me try reshare my screen. Just see if that fixes it. I'm sharing the entire screen, so it shouldn't be. How about now? Is this coming in as examples now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, now it's coming. Great. So yeah, I obviously now I spoiled the fun, but you can see these are very harmless looking expressions, but they have a surprising result. If you're not a computer scientist, you may not expect that result. And the reason we're getting that is that we kind of made a design mistake in the field expression language. So I guess you will not see more stuff coming up. Let me see, can I go back and forth like this? Do you see the full slide with 2 extra bullet points?
Yes.
Yep. Thanks. So yeah, we basically made a design mistake. We used null for 2 things. One is to represent missing data, which is kind of legitimate to have some representative for something that was empty or not available. And then we also abused it to mean that some kind of execution error happened. And the error in particular with all these expressions is that the types don't match, the data types. We have a string and a date, or a string and a number, or numbers and null, which is an own type. So on all of these cases, we simply said, well, if any of that happens, we return null in order to represent to the user that some kind of error happened. The problem with that is it destroys any chance of using that result value for anything else. And I guess if you look at these examples, least intuition or common sense would have probably led to some other results. And you wouldn't want to destroy the work of the person completely just because maybe a null slipped in or the types don't mismatch. In fact, some of them, like this comparison here, where you could simply answer it's false because if A is not equal to 1. So, and this design flaw caused discussions over all the years of DMN evolution. Every now and then we had an issue that touched on that, and we ended up discussing it for half an hour or an hour, and then we didn't really know what to do with it. And now in DMN 1.6, the proposal came up, let's do something about it. Let's try to change feel and change the semantics. And that was a bit of a funny story because we couldn't just change the semantics of our expression language. We cannot just, we have to be backwards compatible, right? So the initial reaction was, yeah, great idea, but we can't do it. It would require DMN 2.0. And we don't really want to do that to the market because that will then lead to fragmentation and a lot of extra effort also for the standardization team, which we don't want to go through. So we were that close to just closing the idea and parking it and not doing anything about it. And then I thought, what can we do within our mandate? So in OMG, when we do a revision of a standard, we are allowed to fix problems and also add new things to address these problems. We're just not allowed to break anything that was already there. So the solution here was a bit of a trick to say, we're introducing an alternative field dialect, like another version of the field language that behaves slightly differently, but is kind of an optional addition that doesn't break anybody's existing code. And so yeah, we thought about that, and then actually weeks and months of discussion followed about what would be a good language design to fix this. We very quickly said, let's not touch the grammar of the language. Let's keep all the syntax exactly the same, but we can we don't abuse null to represent anything else than missing data. And the idea is that now, whenever an error happens, we return values that are not null and are kind of the more expected common sense result. In some cases, this would be quite easily matching the expectation. In other cases, it's a little bit discussion, but yeah, this kind of changed the results. And what spawned or what made this discussion really, really hard in the task force is that we still weren't clear what to do with the error itself, because it's not like nothing happened if you compare two incompatible data types with each other, right? So there is a problem, but bfield wants to fail more gracefully and produce a result that maybe could still be used. So in order to kind of make the discussion even possible, we also decided to decouple error handling completely from this semantical discussion. And in fact, if you look at the previous specifications, it is already stated very clearly that any tool must report errors to the users. And this is actually done in a way that is not part of the returned result, but in a separate channel. That separate channel, unfortunately, is not very well defined. So there's no standard API or no standard exception message, but the language is clear to say every tool needs to report errors. And by making that very clear, we can now touch on the return values, because null isn't really needed to indicate that an error happened. So, and we'll also see there's also a new strict mode that can be used if somebody doesn't want this graceful behavior. So yeah, the hope from here is that hopefully bfield becomes the de facto standard, and the old field will be deprecated, and future models can just be written more simply. So what does this mean? What did we actually change? Here are some of the more smaller examples. We've seen that expression before on the slide. So A equals 1 in traditional field would return null and destroying any option to work with it. In bfield, we would return false, which is kind of the common sense result as well, right? Because A is simply not equal to 1. Just doesn't make sense. There's a counter example on the bottom of the slide. A not equals 1 will obviously return true. So it's not that we're just blindly returning false on everything. We made up our mind what makes sense as a result here. Yeah, and then to show you maybe some of the more juicy examples that really show why this design problem was so problematic. Like the examples I showed earlier. So I guess I will not get the animation going. So maybe I'll like this. Do you see the full slide with a lot of text now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
visible.
Great. So yeah, we've seen the examples from earlier. Now we have a proper string concatenation in the first example. We have a clear answer for A is not equal 1 and it's false. And the sum that we had here with a null in between simply adds up the things that are numbers. And since null is not a number, we are gracefully looking over that and return 4. At the same time, the engine must tell me that there was a null in there. So basically, the wording of the spec is something like, whenever normal field or traditional field would have returned null to indicate the error, you're still forced to report that error on the error channel. The outcome of it is actually a relatively small chapter that we add. We don't need to rewrite the entire field chapter, but we just kind of take a scalpel, open it a little, add a new text that explains the different return values, and then close it nicely as a different dialect. And now for the really interesting examples where you can literally see the business value out of it. So here we want to just check whether the total income is greater than 0. Unfortunately, in traditional field, if total income can be null, we have to do a null check and return false when total income is null. Otherwise, we can, if it's not null, then we can do the normal comparison that we want to do. Obviously, in B field, you can just write total income greater 0, and it will return the right thing. And then the last one here is really complex to read. We want to sum the income items, the value of the income items. However, there might be items that are null for some reason. Maybe we're getting data from a JSON document as input, and some of these are simply empty. So in traditional field, you would have to do a filter on the list, check if any of them is null, or even basically check if all of them are null, then you can return an empty list. Or, oh no, wait, I'm even getting confused by the logic of this, right? So yeah, checking with a filter on all the items, if they are all null, or if they are all not null, if that returns an empty list, you can return 0 as the value of your sum, and else you do the actual sum that you wanted to do. And in B field, you can just let this whole filter business go away. We just sum the items, and if any of them is null, it gets ignored in the sum, and we're summing together what is numbers. Still, the idea about error handling is the same. So you are supposed to get an error message together with this if any of the items was null and the sum was kind of gracefully ignoring the null values. All right. That was maybe a bit to chew on, but we hope a really good addition to the business friendliness of the language. And yeah, as I said, we are hoping that this can become the de facto standard in the future. The transition will be a little bit tricky because obviously a lot of existing models will be designed to use the traditional field logic, so they will have these null checks in them, and they would still work, but obviously it would be nicer to simplify the code. What is to be said is every DMN model has to clearly indicate if B field or a normal field is being used. And then for the entire model, that expression language is to be applied. All right, moving on to other things in DMN 1.6. As I mentioned, we clarified more on the error handling and reporting. And the new addition is that we can also enable a strict mode. So that means that instructs the engine that if any error happens, like these type mismatches we've seen in the examples, we want to immediately stop the execution. Do not produce null and continue, or do not produce B field graceful results and continue, but immediately stop, report the error, and go into a very strict and kind of safe mode of execution without any ambiguities, let's say it like that. In any case, we recommend to just test your models with good input data and make sure that all your logic is working correctly, even the one that is using these new BFEEL results. Then, given all the AI talk, it's worth mentioning that we are now integrating also with ONNX, the Open Neural Network Exchange, which is a standard for interchanging AI and ML models, and that can be now invoked from DMN. However, those are optional features, so not every vendor is forced to implement them. We also made that clear for Java and PNML. And I guess that's it for DMN 1.6. Other changes, as you can see on my slides, we literally spent a lot of time on BFEEL, and then a couple of other things made it. Right. So in summary, for the DMN evolution, one can summarize it with a statement from Bruce Silver that DMN is a very living language. We're constantly listening to feedback from our users, from the TCK, from vendors, and we're continuing to making it more powerful and easier to use as we find new use cases in the wild. However, we're not going for any DMN 2.0 idea that would fragment the market and force everybody to change their implementations, because at the moment there is no need for that. We have a pretty solid specification. So therefore, moving on, what are ideas and plans for DMN 1.7? Currently, DMN 1.7 is scheduled for submission to OMG for March next year. So we haven't started yet, to be honest. We took a bit of summer vacation after the submission in June, and now we'll probably continue the work over the autumn and winter months. Maybe actually DecisionCAMP is a good kickoff point as well, now that everybody gets back into thinking what needs to be done in decision management. So yeah, one thought is obviously maybe further move forward with BFEEL. This is a bit ambitious. I'm not sure if we will agree on any wording or any decision on this one yet, but it's certainly something we have to discuss. Then we have some ideas around retrieving input data from external sources, for example, using a REST call or some kind of service call. Now, the purists among you will say, "Ooh, this is not deterministic," and would probably change the nature of the language forever. However, there is some vendors that are already doing this to load data into models via external data sources. And in that essence, it might be a useful thing to just standardize on how that could be done. There are some other ideas here around maybe making field functions more interchangeable, importing signatures or maybe even implementations and share them between vendors. And there are some other technical things here, like maybe using a new versioning scheme for the XML files or adopting the SCE specification. And that last bullet point is not a coincidence, because that's the next bit I want to talk about. Another specification that we submitted in June. And this one is really one for the nerds. This is not a specification that gives any end user a big value, because as the name suggests, it's common elements between the languages of the BPMN ecosystem. So basically, when we designed another new standard last year and this year, we saw potential to extract certain patterns from BPMN and DMN and make them a separate specification. And historically, these patterns have kind of been copy-pasted from BPMN and used in DMN and others. And now we kind of extracted that to stop the copy and paste, and SDMN will be the first language to use that. And this is kind of interesting for any newer language. If anything gets added to this ecosystem that BPMN started, we can use SCE in future to make life more easy. And well, we'll come to SDMN in a minute, which has been using that. One noteworthy thing in this, so this is just also a bit of nerd stuff from the OMG specifications. All of these specifications are based on UML meta models, and this is kind of the most foundational elements here that we have in all our languages, and SCE kind of standardizes them and makes them reusable. The cool thing about this is it already outlines that feel is supposed to be the default. In hindsight, it should have probably been B feel, but that's again how standards are moving, right? So earlier this year we submitted SCE, and now B feel is maybe the future, but we'll probably see how it evolves. But certainly we advocate for using feel in all the ecosystem. And then another one that is quite fun is we are now standardizing diagram interchange components, which means the fact that you can interchange DMN diagrams and BPMN diagrams is based on another OMG standard. And so far, every specification had to build their own foundational elements for that. SCE standardizes them. And one of the results is that the SDMN specification that we will look at in a minute has literally been one of the shortest specifications ever made there. It has less than 50 pages. And that's definitely an achievement when you compare it to DMN or BPMN. And yeah, part of that is that half the spec is just importing from SCE. Great, SDMN. Let's come to something more practically useful. Shared Data Model and Notation, SDMN, has been submitted to OMG and approved by the Architecture Board in March this year. I expect the final publication will still take until last year, just because there are certain additional voting procedures until it's an officially adopted specification. But since March, the contents are sealed of version 1.0. And here we come back to this picture that I had earlier. So especially vendors or users that are combining BPMN and DMN, they will find themselves in a world where they have data in their processes, and that data is passed to a decision using a decision task, or used to be called business rule task in the past. So that you basically take process data, pass it on to the decision model. The decision model may reference that same data in input data. Hence, we already introduced that alternative notation in DMN to kind of make it look the same. And then the decision is reasoning on it and produces some result. And that result will be passed back to the process and will obviously still have the same shape, the same data structure. So there is a need to describe the data structures in a shared way, and also, yeah, maybe be able to import these data models back and forth. So SDMN, first of all, introduced a data item notation, which is very similar to what BPMN already does, and it allows you on a relatively high level to define containment and composition relationships or references between data items. The more interesting notation, in my opinion, is the data item, the item definition diagram. This is kind of the missing diagram from the DMN specification. If you know DMN, and maybe if you've been using DMN tools, you will have seen that there is already some data structure capability in there. It's called item definitions. However, we kind of always shied away in the DMN task force to define a notation for it. And SDMN has now done that and has come up with this notation. Why this notation? In particular, because we want to be compatible with DMN, and DMN already has boxed expressions which look very similar to this. So we kind of took some notation that is very similar to the existing notation elements that we have. And again, the goal here was to be business friendly, have something easy to understand, and not such a monster like UML, for example, although this would even look a little bit similar to UML if you're looking at the details. So the idea here is you basically have item definitions, and then they can either reference other item definition structures or directly define a composition where, for example, this appointment here is a composition and it's directly embedded in there. Right. What problem does that solve? Well, on the one hand, you can use SDMN to design your data model up front using the SDMN notation. And then after that, define any BPMN or DMN models that are using these data models. So in this case, you would import your SDMN model into BPMN or DMN, and then use it to define out these models. For example, if you use field expressions, you can then use code completion because the field expressions can understand your data model. Or it can be used for validation or some kind of templating where For example, a call activity in BPMN could refer to an SDMN model to define its inputs and outputs. There has been some discussion around even interchanging data mappings with SDMN, but that has been parked for a future revision. So if that's your liking, feel free to raise that as an issue at OMG. And yeah, the other use case for SDMN is simply visualization. If you already have BPMN and DMN models, you could now use that missing notation that you never had and use SDMN to visualize these models. In that case, an SDMN model can import a DMN model that has item definitions without a graph, without a diagram, and just add the diagram layer on top of that. So in fact, SDMN does not introduce any new structures for item definitions. Instead, it directly imports that from the DMN specification. So while it is kind of designed and evolved as a separate standard, it's obviously meant to be used. So there's almost no use case for SDMN outside the domain of DMN and BPMN. All right. Yeah, I think I mostly already explained this slide of why we chose this kind of notation. Exactly. It's reusing a lot, not redefining stuff, reinventing the wheel. And yeah, of course, the goal is always to be business friendly and not something that computer scientists can understand, like, I don't know, any other data modeling language that is out there. Right. Time for key takeaways. If I summarize my really main wishes, my main goals out of this presentation is I encourage vendors and users to adopt DMN 1.6 and move on with the versions that are being created, because as Bruce summarized, we're that living language. We're constantly adding new capabilities to make the language more powerful, more easy to use. Obviously, I think I talked long enough about B-field to argue that that's a good addition and makes life easier for people. And even in my own life as a consultant, as a pre-saler for Camunda, I have had situations where I literally shied away from doing certain things with feel just because I knew I would need to go into this ugly null check situation and I would have to write a screen full of field code just to express something otherwise simple. And yeah, as a pre-saler, I obviously don't want to embarrass myself in front of the customer, either needing half an hour to solve a simple problem because of these extra checks I need to write, and also showing them super ugly code. So maybe could help also to sell our products more easily if these kind of null abuse would stop. And remind you, your tools need to still produce error reports. So if your tool doesn't show you errors, ask your vendors to add them. And then last but not least, SDMN shared data models between either among DMN models. I'm not sure if I emphasized that point good enough. Obviously, you could also share a data model between different DMN models. You can do that already with item definitions today and park them in a separate DMN file. But now with SDMN, you have that visual layer on top of that, which may make it even easier to define them in a visual way. And then BPMN is obviously benefiting as well from having a solid data model, so you can use field expressions with code completion and the likes. And yeah, last shout out, if you want to get involved, there's obviously ways to join OMG and get involved in this work. The easiest thing you can do, if you have ideas or issues with any of the languages I presented, there is a publicly accessible issue reporting form that you can use to raise issues to OMG and for the task forces to discuss. Big bonus points if you already include a proposal in your issue. So if you have an idea how to solve it, feel free to include that. But ideally decouple it. Clearly describe the problem first and then your proposed solution. If you want to really join the task force, you're more than welcome as well. It's, in my opinion, especially the DMN task force is super strong. We have really good engineers and scientists in the room that can, and practitioners, so that we really look at the language from all angles. And I personally learned a lot in chairing this task force, both in, I guess, moderation skills and keeping the team under control and productive. And then also just learning more depth of decision management and decision automation. And yeah, you can also become an OMG member if you're not already a member. There's trial memberships available. And if you don't want to bother with any of this OMG business, there's also the DMN TCK, which is a community project on GitHub, which you can also join without being member of anything. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Thanks, Jacob, for the invitation, and I'm obviously available for questions.
Okay, thank you, Falko. Questions?
Let me take my key takeaways. I think I saw a couple of things already flying by in the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and voice a question, feel free to do so.
There are some just comments
Can
and
you
questions.
hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I had a question. I caught your slide as it was passing, so I may have got this wrong. If so, I apologize. But it seemed to me, going back to BFeel, that you had a slide, you had a line that said that quotes A greater than 1 is false. And I presume, therefore, that quotes A is less than or equal to 1 is also false. Is that right?
Let me go back to the example. I guess it was this one. Yeah, I guess in this one here, we may have some examples, or if not, but yeah, so it's basically any comparison between things that are not compatible will typically return false.
The only question I would have about that is there's a kind of implied identity, mathematical identity, which says that if you have two variables, A and B, then the truth of A is less than B is always not the truth of A is greater than or equal to B, because it's part of the identity of the comparison operator. So I wondered, could you come unstuck using this in a decision table if these two apparently converse operations were having the same result?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing, we definitely had lengthy discussions about what makes sense and what doesn't. We tried to come up with a relatively clear rule to say we are returning the most sensible non-null result, so that at least you're getting the feature that the data type doesn't change, right? Because in traditional field, null changes the data type of almost any expression, and that then immediately means you have a type.
I'm well aware from experience how toxic null is. I completely agree with the motivation behind the change. It's just that, and this is a slightly geekish and maybe nerdy concern, but I just don't like violating mathematical identities. It often doesn't go to a nice place.
Yeah, well, there might certainly be some endpoints that are difficult. As I pointed out already, best is to have good test cases for your models. And of course, feel free to raise issues if for any of these we may have taken the wrong decision or we're creating too much trouble there.
I completely agree about the testing. Absolutely.
All right.
We have a question from Gary.
What if you provided null-friendlier variants of the problem?
Hey, Falko, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, yeah. I'll go ahead and read it because, yeah, you were almost finished. But you were bringing up almost fond memories from 10 years ago or so where we were rehashing or hashing, I guess. Now we're rehashing, these ideas. And I remember, the possibility of adding like a try catch or something seemed kind of beyond the pale, but we were worried exactly about missing these possible errors. So I think the error channel makes sense. Standardizing it, of course, would be great, but some other languages handle this by having different variations of the operators. So I just you could have some tilde or some other asterisk or whatever else. I guess that would just be a lot of new operators, and maybe that would decrease the business friendliness, but maybe it would be less of a breaking change.
I think we discussed that as well, and we found that maybe again more a computer science argument to make the language more with more operators. So yeah, we found this way of more graceful result values to be the better solution for normal people. And of course, it is a bit of a compromise.
I guess the concern would be, as Jan was pointing out, that it could, effectively be masking some problems that might have more subtle manifestations later on. But I mean, there's certainly no perfect solution to this that's been found so far. So I think all you can do is just kind of offer a couple of choices and let people pick.
Indeed. And we also we did not want to enter this Pandora's box of arbitrary type conversions, while you could argue that, for example, for the string concatenation and some of the number stuff, we're almost doing like type conversions, but it's very limited to very specific cases, and we're not starting to become a language where you then have to learn all sorts of magic. The rules for BFEEL are relatively straightforward and summarized in like 2 lines of text in the beginning of that chapter.
Yeah. No, good. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the update.
And we have one more question from Alex about CDMN. This is constrained DMN from KU Leuven. Anything what you consider?
So I have to embarrass myself here that I don't know about that dialect or variation of the language.
Yeah, it means no. Okay. But it was few presentations on previous DecisionCAMP, so you can find it's quite interesting approach, user-friendly and much more powerful. Anyway, thank you very much. It's not simple presentation, and it's not difficult to do it, especially when you say the words like normal people prefer 3 dots, and who are normal people, who are not normal people. So that's quite difficult. And I know that it's not easy, and we really appreciate you doing what you did, and wishing you all the best with better standards. And now we're going, thank you. Let me stop recording and stop recording. And we want now to take a break.